Hey, everybody. Nice to see y'all. Happy Earth Day. I guess we're on. We got to make a switch here from architecture to food issues, food and climate. I see Tom, Elizabeth, Bruce, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks. I got to thank Sarah, our host, for running this all and putting it all together. This panel that we're about to get into is called Food and Climate Connections. And it was inspired by students in a class that I teach, a class called Sustainable Food Systems. One of my students came up with a quote by Janet Ranganathan. You may have heard of her. She's from the World Resources Institute, and I probably just butchered her name. But anyway, she said, food is the mother of all sustainability challenges. And I like that quote because it's so short. I can even remember it, and it makes sense. And I obviously think it's true. I'm a food studies person. It was inspired by students, and then they started asking a lot of questions that might seem obvious, like why is our farming system in America so weird, and how come we basically use 25 million pounds of pesticides, of antibiotics in raising our poultry in the United States, or we spread 250 million pounds of glyphosate all over our plants. And, and isn't it wild that over 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions are coming from livestock production? So they're throwing these questions at me. We're talking about this stuff. And I said, I really need to get some experts in here. We're going to get some experts in at EcoFest. And so I asked Philpott, Friedrich, and Royte to come and talk. And it sounds kind of like a law firm, doesn't it? Friedrich, Philpott, and Royte. And in many ways, they are like a law firm. These three people are incredible authors, thinkers, innovators, but they're also advocates for the planet. They're not lawyers per se, but the work that they do for the planet is incredibly hopeful. It gives me hope that the Earth may survive because of people like these guys. So we're going to hear from them, probably some hopeful signs, maybe some hopeful signs. We're going to hear from Tom, Bruce, and Elizabeth in that order. I want to tell you a little bit about them. Elizabeth Royte is a nature and science writer. She's done things for New York Times Magazine, a great piece on the Compost King of New York. She's written books, Garbage Land and Bottlemania. She just recently did this great piece for, I think it was National Geographic, right? About neonicotinoids out west and how they're not just affecting insects anymore, but they're affecting mammals, deer, cattle, probably us. Anyway, we're going to hear from her, but before that, we'll hear from Bruce Friedrich. Bruce is co-founder of the Good Food Institute, GFI, which is focused on supporting and developing non-animal based proteins, what he would call clean proteins. And he co-wrote a book by that title, as a matter of fact. He's got degrees from the London School of Economics and Johns Hopkins. He comes at things from a sort of marketing, business, and save the earth framework, all about alternative non-animal protein sources. It'll be great to hear from him. But first, we're going to start today with Tom Philpott. Tom, you probably know as the agriculture writer, correspondent guy at Mother Jones. He's been there for quite a while. He's also got a great blog on Mother Jones, a food blog. He's written all kinds of things about food workers in slaughterhouses, a lot of expose material that shows up how messed up the food system is. His recent book, Perilous Bounty, I cannot recommend highly enough. It's a really good read. And he's able to talk about these things in a way that makes you kind of feel okay. But it's basically about how discombobulated our food system is. And he can say it much better than I can, and he probably won't use the word discombobulated. I hope not. He'll use much bigger words. So anyway, I'm going to turn it over to you, Tom, and let you talk. You can share your screen and do it however you want.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. I can't say how excited I am to be here at this incredible and important public education institution, CUNY. When I was invited, I snapped at it just to show solidarity with a great public education institution. And I think what I'm going to do in my talk is give just a brief TLDR of my book. But it actually isn't that long, and I do hope you read it. But I just wanted to sort of lay out the argument that I make that I think I can do in 6 minutes. I'm staring at the clock. And so what I invite you to do in the book is look at a typical plate of food that you might be served for a meal in the United States. At the center of it, there's probably a piece of meat. And on the side of it, you know, sort of as the side dish, as we call it, there's probably some vegetables and maybe some fruits. And so the argument that I make in the book is that if you trace those foods back to where they really originate from, two regions in the United States emerge. For fruits and vegetables, by far our dominant source of fruits and vegetables is California. And I think that's true of almost any grocery store in the United States, almost any time of the year. And if you look at the meat on your plate, if the animal itself wasn't grown in the Corn Belt, it's almost certain that the corn and soybeans that fed those animals came from the Corn Belt. So we have really these two dominant regions that underpin our food system. And I devote a section of the book to each of them and show that they are in a state of ecological unraveling. And to the theme of this EcoFest that we're involved in here, climate change is accelerating the situation in both cases. And my book isn't so much about the contribution of our food system to climate change through the emission of greenhouse gases. It's more about how incredibly fragile our system is to climate change. So what I show is that in California, agriculture in this area, especially in the Central Valley, but not just the Central Valley, has gotten so big and so ravenous for water that it's outstripped the region's, rather actually excellent water resources. For a Mediterranean climate of its size, California has incredible water resources, but agriculture has just gotten so big and so thirsty there that it has overstripped sort of the natural limits of water availability and is in the process of sucking the aquifer dry. We're about to enter in California. We appear to be at the edge of yet another major drought. And I think we're gonna stop at some point seeing these as droughts and start to realize that what we're seeing there is a new normal. So I tease that out, and I also tease out the fact that the same kind of, you can dig into the book for the details, but the same kind of unusual weather patterns of California mean that while drought is almost certainly can be expected to continue and deepen and be more the norm, there's also the massive problem of mega floods. And it's more likely than not, and you can dig into the book for details about why a mega flood in the Central Valley is pretty likely over the next 20 years. And so that's the perilous bounty that we're getting from California. We've thrown our lot with this area, and it's in a precarious place. In the Corn Belt, the situation, the real trouble with the Corn Belt is the over reliance on just two crops, corn and soybeans, to grow the sort of feed for this meat system has put us in a situation where soil, the incredible store of topsoil that is in the Midwest, that is one of the greatest sources of topsoil in the world, it's as unusual and precious is California's combination of Mediterranean climate and giant mountain range on its eastern edge. It's that unusual in the global system, and this reliance on these two crops are triggering a massive soil erosion crisis. And soil erosion there is a lot more serious than the USDA accounts for, and also in a pretty incredible over-reliance on pesticides, because when you have monocrops, you're creating this ideal environment for their pests, and that's the root of the neonicotinoid crisis that Elizabeth Royte wrote so beautifully about recently. And so, and just like in California, climate change is certain to worsen the situation in the Midwest, because the main driver of this erosion are these heavy spring and early summer storms that pummel the ground when it's bare, because when you grow only two crops that are harvested at the same time and planted at the same time, you get this period when there's nothing on the ground to protect it, and that's the main reason why the soil is eroding, is these storms. And these storms have gotten significantly more stronger in the past 20 years, and they are due to get stronger still. And I believe I'm at my 6 minutes. I do go into solutions to this, and maybe we can talk about that later in the discussion. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much. We will have questions for you later, because your book has got a whole lot of great things about some of the positive things that are also happening with farmers doing some really innovative stuff. And I want to get into that, because, like I said, when I introduced all of you, I need a little hope also. And I think you can provide that, but I think that's a really good synopsis of how we are kind of, bifurcated, whatever. We got the Midwest and we got the West Coast. And I also want to ask you a little bit about diversity later. But before we get to all that, I'd like to turn it over to Bruce and ask Bruce to, I guess, share your screen, do whatever you want, jump in and start talking about clean proteins. And I'll turn it over to you, Bruce. Thank you.
I'm impressed that Tom kept to 6 minutes. You've set a very high bar for the other panelists, Tom.
I didn't even have to time him.
That's impressive. All right, I'm going to speak a little bit more quickly here in order to keep the 6 minutes. But so I run an organization called the Good Food Institute. People can see my screen, I hope. All right, awesome. And the focus of GFI is basically looking at the external costs of meat production and figuring out what we can do to solve them. So Professor Hellermann already mentioned the climate impact of meat production. It's more than all forms of transportation combined. Funneling crops through animals exacerbates the problems that Tom was talking about. Chicken is the most efficient animal at turning crops into meat. According to the World Resources Institute, it takes 9 calories into a chicken to get 1 calorie back out, which means it takes 9 times as much land, 9 times as much water, 9 times as much pesticide and herbicide. It's inefficient, it's bad, it contributes to climate change. And then finally, Professor Hellermann also mentioned that 70 to 80% of antibiotics are fed to farm animals. Farm animals also contribute to pandemic risk. So what's the solution? It doesn't seem to be person-by-person education. I'm guessing everybody on this call is aware of these harms. Everybody in government is certainly aware of these harms. Everybody in the climate community is aware of these harms. Bill Gates, when he was doing his book tour, was basically said in pretty much every interview that food has been the third rail of climate policy because nobody can figure out what to do about it. At GFI, we think one part of the solution is stopping, well, not stopping, but complementing the person-by-person education and trying to convince people to eat less meat, which is may be part of the solution, but we've literally been doing that for 50 years since Diet for a Small Planet came out 50 years ago this year. We think that you can make meat from plants as one option. So just like your phone doesn't require a cord and it's still a phone, and your camera doesn't require analog film and it's still a camera, we can constitute what meat is. Meat is lipids, aminos, minerals, and water. We can give people the exact same meat experience. We can make products from plants that taste exactly the same or better. And because it's so much more efficient as it scales up, it should cost the same or less, and it will simply win in the marketplace. We do think a lot of people want to eat actual animal meat. For people who want to eat actual animal meat, we can cultivate meat directly from cells. Still far more efficient, and consequently, as it scales up, it should cost less. It's the exact same product, but with no possibility of antibiotic resistance, antibiotic residues. If it's sea animals, no possibility of mercury or dioxin poisoning. Bill Gates is particularly enthusiastic about this in his book. The first thing he talks about in the How People Are Fed section is alternative proteins. And he points out that the climate community has a bit of a mantra: electrify everything. This is electrify everything for meat. It eliminates ruminant digestion and all of the methane production, which is 20 times as powerful as than carbon dioxide as a climate gas. It eliminates the nitrous oxide from manure decomposition, which is 250 times as powerful as a greenhouse gas. And it eliminates all of the extra stages of production and focuses on the factory. Impossible and Beyond are pretty much the two companies that are doing this right now. There are lots and lots of veggie burger companies sort of competing with one another, but the two companies that are laser focused on we need products that taste the same or better and that cost the same or less, they use 1/20 of the land and cause 1/10 of the climate impact. And that's at tiny scale. That's at like 1/100th of the global meat industry. As this scales up, the land numbers won't get better, but the climate change numbers will get significantly better. With cultivated meat, basically the same thing. Cultivated beef, about 1/10 of the climate impact and 1/20th of the land. This gives you a double whammy from a food and climate impact perspective. It's both way less emissions and it frees up so much land that can be used for regenerative agriculture, that can be used for rewilding, that can be used, it definitely preserves forests, so a variety of ways in which that's helpful. As Professor Hellermann nodded at, 70 to 80% of antibiotics are fed to farm animals. This takes the risk of your food leading to antibiotic resistance from significant to zero with plant-based and cultivated meat. It also takes the risk of your food causing the next pandemic from the most likely, according to the United Nations, to zero. Number one, according to the UN Environment Program, likely cause the next pandemic is increased demand for animal protein. Number two is basically the same thing. Number 7 is climate change. All three of those are significantly addressed. So your food goes from most likely to zero if you're making your meat from plants or cultivating it directly from cells. These are our federal goals in terms of alternative proteins. We think governments, for the same reason they are funding open access science on renewable energy, should be funding open access science on plant-based and cultivated meat. For the same reason they are incentivizing private sector R&D and private sector manufacturing and infrastructure buildup, they should be doing that for alternative proteins. This is what we want to see happen globally. There is a clean energy ministerial. There needs to be a ministerial focused on forests, food, and land. We would also like to see bilateral and multilateral partnerships focused on shifting meat production from industrial animal meat to plant-based meat, cultivated meat, and regenerative ranching. This is GFI. You can find out lots more about us at gfi.org. We have just north of 100 people in 6 regions of the world. Mostly we're focused on policy and science. We do some corporate engagement, which would be the controversial part of this panel if we dive into it. We work closely with the biggest meat and food companies in the world to try to make this into transition and not disruption. People who want to learn all about GFI, gfi.org/newsletters. This is me on Twitter. and this is GFI on Twitter. And I did not meet the challenge, but 6:45, I almost met it. Sorry to talk so fast, but hopefully that gives us some fodder for discussion later.
It certainly does. You've given me a real mouthful of clean protein here. And you do speak fast, man. Oh man, that's a lot of good stuff to explore. I want to talk later about the whole idea of funding choices and moving resources, either federal resources or private resources. And I think it's some things that I read on your website and what you just alluded to. And I'm hoping that we can get into that later, because it's also something that applies to what Tom was talking about, and I'm sure it applies to what Liz is going to talk about, and we'll see what we get from the Q&A also. So people, get your questions ready for all three of our panelists, and thank you so much for that, Bruce. It is a lot to take in 6 minutes.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay. We can handle it. I mean, I am a teacher, right? So it's fine. Let's move on. Let's move on to Elizabeth, and then we'll come back and we'll talk question and answer stuff. Okay. So Elizabeth, we'll turn it over to you. It's your show.
Thank you. I'll try and talk a little bit slower, but I'm not going to speak extemporaneously. I am no good at that. So pardon my lack of eye contact. So thanks, Mark. Good afternoon, people of City Tech, and thank you for inviting me to meet with you today. As Mark said, I'm a Brooklyn-based writer of books and magazine features on environmental topics, and I became interested in food waste while writing a book that followed different streams of discards after they left my curb. I knew that I wanted to shrink my garbage footprint and beat the national average of wasting, which is 4.4 pounds of waste per person per day, including recyclables. So I started weighing everything I tossed. This was gross and tedious. I did it for an entire year, but it was also enlightening. I quickly realized that food scraps are heavy and wet, and so composting instead of trashing them was a no-brainer. But there are other more compelling reasons to reduce the amount of food that all of us waste. From our curbsides in New York and elsewhere, wasted food mostly goes to landfills, but once buried, food rots and generates the greenhouse gas methane. In the short term, methane is 84 times stronger than carbon dioxide at trapping the Earth's heat. If global food waste were a country, it would be the third largest generator of greenhouse gases in the world. Unfortunately, wasted food makes up more than a fifth of the stuff that we send to dumps. Nationally, Americans waste 63 million tons of edible food a year between distributors, retailers, and kitchens. If you count tonnages lost on farms, we're annually wasting a third of the food produced globally. That's enough sustenance to feed almost 2 billion people. This is, as you probably know, a very big deal. First, because 690 million people today don't know where their next meal is coming from. Secondly, because growing food that doesn't get eaten also squanders the resources it takes to produce that food, including water, labor, seeds, ag chemicals, and fuel to operate farm machinery. According to one expert, the production of uneaten food in the US gobbles 70 times the amount of oil lost in the Deepwater Horizon disaster in the Gulf of Mexico. Now think about land. In 2007, a collective 3.5 billion acres, that's an area significantly larger than Canada, was plowed to grow food or to support livestock and dairy production that no one ate. The world's population is currently around 8 billion, and it's predicted to hit nearly 10 billion by 2050. And so how are we going to feed so many people on a finite planet? A dominant narrative calls for increasing global food production by 70 to 100%. But agriculture already represents one of the greatest threats to planetary health because it pollutes waterways, clears forests, and generates a third of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. But people who study food waste say we've already got plenty of food on hand. All we need to do is distribute it more efficiently, eat less meat and dairy, divert fewer food crops to biofuels, and boost yields on underperforming acres. Put it all together and we will be able to feed those billions without converting the planet's remaining wetlands, grasslands, and forests to farm fields. Let's go back and look at how so much food gets wasted. On the farm, managers frequently overplant, sometimes by as much as 10%, to hedge their bets against bad weather and pests, and to meet supermarket contracts, which are unforgiving. come up short on your green beans and a farmer may lose her buyer. Farmers also leave unharvested entire blocks of fruit or vegetables for fear of flooding the market and depressing prices. Sometimes the cost of labor to harvest a crop exceeds the value of selling it. In supermarkets, managers routinely overorder for fear of running out of a product and losing customers. Entire shelves of perfectly edible Bing cherries are transferred into dumpsters to make room for incoming Bing cherries. Sometimes it makes more economic sense to tip surplus food into the trash rather than to lower its price, which would undercut sales of full-priced food. In the developing world, far more food is lost at the beginning of the food chain than the end. Without adequate storage facilities and transport, up to 20% of sub-Saharan grain succumbs to mold, insects, and rodents, and that's enough food to nourish 48 million people for a year. In the absence of refrigeration, dairy products and fish spoil. Without the capacity to pickle, can, dry, or bottle foods, surpluses of perishables can't be converted into shelf-stable products. Bad road and rail conditions slow the trek from farm to market. Poorly packed fruit gets jostled into mush, leafy greens wilt for lack of shade and cooling. So why do you and I here in New York waste so much? Because we overbuy relatively cheap and seductively packaged food. We store it improperly. We take use-by dates on yogurt and hummus literally, though such date stamps were designed to communicate peak freshness and have nothing to do with actual food safety. We forget to eat our leftovers and we suffer little or no consequence for scraping edible food into a bin or down the drain. As people who study food waste and food loss like to say, the scope and scale of the problem means there are a gazillion ways to make improvements. Indeed, the United Nations has announced a goal to cut food waste in half by 2030. In developing nations, aid groups are helping smallholders store, transport, and better preserve their bounty. In the US, new technologies are helping restaurants measure what they toss, the first step, as I learned from my own garbage experiment, in curtailing waste. Restaurants offer smaller portions, colleges have moved away from large plates and trays in cafeterias, which encourage diners to take more than they can eat. Technologists are playing around with sensors that can be placed on produce in the field in the hopes that knowing the strawberry's temperature, humidity, and travel history will help store managers better track and promote this perishable stock. Advocacy groups are working to standardize expiration labels, to ban food from landfills, and to lift bans on feeding food waste to pigs, which would help protect tropical forests from being cleared to grow soybeans for swine meal. Feeding livestock on the food we currently waste would globally liberate enough cereals to feed 3 billion people. Supermarkets have always donated surplus to food banks and soup kitchens, and during the pandemic, restaurants started doing this as well, as did other food service outlets. The last few years have seen an explosion of apps and other platforms that help individuals move excess food to other individuals. Gardeners share their bounty using websites like Ample Harvest or Neighborhood Fruit. And then there's all those new sidewalk refrigerators, stocked by anyone to serve anyone willing to open the door. So what can you do to address the environmental, social, and economic scourge of wasted food? Lots. Learn to plan meals. Buy only what you will eat and then eat what you bought. Shop at farmers markets if you can, because the produce is fresher than supermarket fare and so likely to last longer in your fridge. Learn how to preserve and store food properly, cooking and freezing stuff that might expire before you can eat it. Think about soups and stews. Blend bruised fruit into smoothies, and if you want to get all pioneer woman, take it another step and learn how to ferment and pickle. If you're more of the dining out type, don't forget to request a doggy bag for your leftovers, or bring your own container to reduce waste. Tell the waiter to hold the bread and butter if you don't plan on even touching it. Whatever you do, don't waste meat and dairy, which have the heaviest environmental footprint of all foods, because those animals require enormous quantities of grain and water. Once you've done all you can, try to compost your scraps in a home bin, through a curbside collection program, or at a farmer's market that collects that food waste. I've given you a general picture of where food loss and waste occur and some of the interesting reasons why it happens, but I hope that you realize also that this cannot go on. Earth's population is rising, as are food prices. Climate change will reduce food production, and we must learn how to sustainably coax more calories from land that's already under cultivation, sparing further conversion of natural ecosystems. I'll end with something a researcher at the UN once told me. Food waste is a stupid problem, but people love stupid problems because they know they can do something about it. And I agree. Thanks, and I'll take questions later in the session.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Liz. I like stupid problems too, but I'm not usually able to figure them out. I think you gave us some very nice kind of working actions that can be done. I'm hoping that a lot of my students are watching, because not only do they get extra credit, but they're working on food waste projects, and they're working on ways to alleviate it. They have to do something called an issue and action project. So they need to actually take some action. And your list is a good individual list of individual actions that can happen to minimize food waste. I think that there's a couple of things that I thought of that I wanted to ask you that are specifically about food waste. And I'm going to take a look at any questions that came in, but first I want you to think about how you think things might be changing in the city of New York with its so many people accumulating and creating so much food waste. When do you think composting is going to be coming back, and what's going to make that happen? Maybe not just in New York City, but also on a broader scale, is what I would like to know. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. And if Tom or Bruce had any comments on that, that would be fine too.
Well, I would say that having a new mayor would be helpful. There's one candidate, Catherine Garcia, who was the former commissioner of the Department of Sanitation, and before that she was at the DEP. And I feel like that's her whole platform, is like waste, discards, recycling, and she was very much behind the curbside collection program, which was suspended because of budget cuts, because of the pandemic. And as we start recovering, I'm hopeful that no matter who's elected, that they will restore the curbside program. Nationally, I don't know. If people understood, I think, a little better the good that it does, and the bad that it does when by burying these scraps. I don't know. Like in New York, the people who had curbside when it was suspended, I just heard from so many people who felt so terrible about putting food into the trash, and it's your kitchen smells worse, your trash is heavier, you're taking it out more often, and everyone wants it to come back who's ever tried it, I think.
Oh, I agree. And there's a number of people who are taking it upon themselves to deal with it on a kind of a personal neighborhood level, as you know, some organizations and individuals, and that's kind of filling the gap. Yeah, let's hope for a mayor that makes it a priority in New York City. And I have no idea how this is approached on a national level any more than you do.
Landfill bans are one. There's a lot of that in the EU. If you're a major generator of food waste, and it starts with the large, supermarkets, and then works its way down. But legislation, national legislation.
And I think that some cities have legislation that deals with restaurants and their food waste. Although there's a lot of ways around it also, as you know. We'll get back to this, but a couple of questions just came in that I want to address to some of the other panelists here. One thing that just came in, this is kind of a Bruce thing. How long will it take, Bruce, for alternative proteins to completely replace meat? So we want you to look in your crystal ball here, I guess. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's going to depend a lot on the degree to which the climate and global health NGOs really get behind it. So we've seen Breakthrough Energy and Bill Gates getting behind it in ways that are useful. We were successful in getting about $5 million in government funding in 2020, and we're making connections with legislators. We work with 15 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate to ask John Kerry to put it onto the national climate strategy. One thing just to underline about alternative proteins is it doesn't require nation by nation action. It doesn't require city by city action. It doesn't require person by person action. Because it takes advantage of science and markets, it can scale super fast. So a really nice, I think, comparison is renewable energy. The goal of renewable energy is to make solar and wind simply cost less, and it just becomes how we power our lives. The goal of Tesla and sort of the movement toward electric vehicles is to make the electric vehicles better than combustion engine vehicles, and they just power our lives. So GFI's Asia Pacific office is based in Singapore, not because we care what people in Singapore are eating, and we have significant operations in Israel, not because we care what the Israelis are eating. We're in those two countries because they are extremely technologically advanced, and because they are small, they're very excited about the idea of making meat from plants and cultivating meat from cells because it requires so many fewer inputs. So GFI is trying to create a sort of space race focused on food. And Biden's American Jobs Plan, if you pull it up and you look at the press release and you look at their talking points, the thing the media doesn't cover very much, number one, it's jobs. Number two, it's infrastructure. Number three, it's out-innovate China. And the reason for that is that you look at something like electric vehicles, the US has 4 gigafactories for lithium-ion batteries. China has 93. In 10 years, the US is going to have 10 of these gigafactories. China's going to have 140. So we're meeting with a lot of enthusiasm in Congress for the idea, do you want meat, all meat basically, to be made in China in the future? So plant-based meat and cultivated meat, this is how we lessen meat's adverse impact on climate. This is how we eliminate meat's contribution to antibiotic resistance, which the UK government says is a more certain threat to the human race than climate change. This is how we prevent the next COVID-19. If governments really get on board with this, and they fund the science and they fund the transition, I'm not gonna pick a number, but it can and should happen in the course, not of generations, but of decades. The transition could happen.
That's a positive outlook. I think we would all welcome that. I think changing people's tastes is a real challenge. Being a food person trained as a chef, I think that it's always difficult to make those alternative meat changes when you put them on the plate. That's in many ways another issue, and that's something that chefs need to.
But I want to underline, Professor Hellermann, this is not about convincing people to change their tastes.
No.
This is not veggie burgers. This is not behavior change. This is in the same way that your phone, we didn't have to convince people to not have a cord. We didn't have to convince people to shift to cameras that didn't require film. This is, you give people the exact same product, but it costs less. Cultivated meat is the exact same product, except that it doesn't, you don't have to operate your kitchen like a biohazard lab. Plant-based meat is the exact same product, but without the external costs, without the possibility of antibiotic resistance, without mercury and dioxin poisoning, et cetera. They are better products, less expensive. Consumers don't have to change how they think about food at all, which is why this works.
Okay, thank you for that. I want to get Tom to weigh in on this also, because you probably know more about the Farm Bill than the rest of us, and maybe is there a question of moving resources from the kind of farming that is basically putting us in a crisis situation towards the kind of food production that Bruce is talking about? Do you see that happening at all in our ag system?
In terms of actual policy change in Washington, the Farm Bill comes up in 2023, so the year after the midterm elections. And I would be really reluctant to predict at this point what could possibly happen. I do know that we have seen some pretty radical change in our political system, obviously in the past, since the transition from Donald Trump to Joe Biden. And there have been things in that transition that have really surprised me. Like, I would not have thought that there would be economic policymakers in power thinking about something like full employment and putting, inflation on the back burner in policymaking, which is, overturning 30 years of or more neoliberalism. And so from that perspective, could we get a farm bill that doesn't reward the same kind of production that I talk about in my book? I have gotten really pessimistic about farm bills in recent years, but I think there is a potential and possibility for change. And I think a lot of it depends on the midterm elections and how they go. There will be no change if the Democrats lose one or more of the chambers in the House and Senate. But I think now is the time to get out there and get political about these issues, because we are in a time of political flux. Things in Washington, I've never seen things in my entire adult life observing politics in more flux than they are now. There is more potential for positive change and more potential for catastrophic change than I've ever seen. So I think it's time to get organized and rally around a progressive agricultural agenda that doesn't merely prop up the status quo.
Yeah, I'm not too optimistic about the farm bill either, because there's so much entrenched power there.
I would say that I'm more optimistic about it than I have been since I started studying this stuff. I think there's more. There are more possibilities before us politically than there have been in a long time.
I got a couple other questions that are they're a little bit all over the place here, but one person asks, Liz, when we're composting our food, are we creating methane? And I think most of us know the answer to that, but you want to explain that?
I'll try to. I think if we're composting properly, we're not, because it's an aerobic process, and Tom can speak to this because he's done a ton of composting in his life. Methane is generated in anaerobic conditions, and so if you're not mixing your nitrogenous and your carboniferous elements properly, it can get really stinky, and methane doesn't smell, but that's like one of the signs that you're doing it wrong. And there are people who believe that a better way to handle food scraps is by generating methane in an enclosed vessel, and then you're aiming to develop the methane, and then you capture it, scrub it up, and put it into gas lines and use it for energy or for heat. But maybe Tom can say more about methane and compost.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think you nailed it, and I think that second option you mentioned is not the way forward, because basically we're at a point where we need to start winding down fossil fuel infrastructure and not finding new ways to elongate it. The world does not need more natural gas. The process you're talking about is essentially creating natural gas, and the world doesn't need more natural gas. In fact, we're awash in fracked natural gas. And I think that that one of the things that's always inspired me about your work, Elizabeth, is just the way that you talk about how we can take these problems like methane coming out of landfills and turn them into solutions like providing fertility for urban gardens, urban farms, or even farms around a city like New York. The compost that's generated from a curbside program could not only remove loads and loads of methane from the atmosphere, but it could also you create products out of it. You could subsidize farms and gardeners by giving it away for free. You could charge something for it if that's what you want. But yeah, the whole The thing is that everything we take out of the land needs to be replaced if we're going to keep agriculture going. And one great way to contribute to that is by recycling food waste back into the land.
Yes. Yeah, keep it as a big cycle, the cycle of life, as some people would say. I like that. I like that, Tom. Thank you. Thank you. Somebody else just checked in with me and said, Elizabeth, what policy change might be needed in order to promote gleaning? Is there any kind of a gleaning movement happening out there?
And how? Yeah. I don't think gleaning is illegal anywhere. I wrote about this a while ago. Is it the Society of St. Anthony or St. Andrew? People can look into this. You can Google this and find out. There's gleaning networks across the country. I don't know if we're talking to an international audience, but many, many farmers are happy to welcome gleaners. Church groups organize a lot of them, and Cub Scouts and Boy Scouts go out and they glean, and they're going through fields collecting the fruits and vegetables that aren't perfect for the market or are just surplus, and they're packing them up and bringing them to pantries and soup kitchens or all kinds of outlets. I think it's better to do it in an organized way. I don't, maybe Tom again can speak to this as a farmer, but like inviting people individually one by one to just come and get their dinner might introduce problems to a farm, but an organized group that is led by someone who can instruct people and not be a hassle to the farmer is the way to go.
I want to ask both you and Tom about something that I heard on my favorite radio station earlier this week about a group of young college grads who have taken it upon themselves to essentially work with excess farm produce and take it into needy areas. They're doing this on the West Coast. And it started as they realized that a farmer had all these extra eggs. They packed up a rented truck with eggs, took them to different soup kitchens in the LA region, and it's expanded across the country now. And I can't remember the name of these folks, but to me, it sounds like a system that can make use of all this excess that you talked about. Farmers tend to overplant for various reasons, and oftentimes they have that extra, right?
It's a growing ecosystem of it's like matching up the supply with the demand and having transportation at the right time and capacity to keep it cold when it gets there. And it sounds great. It is mostly great, but there's a lot of details that need to be worked out. But technology is helping solve some of that and matching up supply and demand.
Tom, from a farmer's point of view, do you think is this a viable approach? This as independent groups working on farm excess and redistributing it?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I remember, I was part of a farm in North Carolina, and one of the things that we would do after the farmers market was anything we had left over that we had enough of at home, we would, as a matter of course, after the market, drop it off at a food bank. And I think that kind of thing, I think what Elizabeth is saying is that it takes organization and coordination to do it on a large scale, because if everyone drops food off at the food bank at the same time, it could overwhelm the food bank. So it should be rationalized. And I think the USDA is in a pretty good position to do something like that. I remember, the heartbreaking stories early in the pandemic of food being dumped because supply chains went so wacky, while at the same time, hunger spiked, especially childhood hunger. And I think, something like the USDA buying food, it's got the infrastructure in place in some ways to buy the food and distribute it to people who need it. That way the farmer isn't sitting on a loss, and hungry people can get access to high quality food. I think improving programs like that could go a long way. And I think that, it's also probably something that is really well done at the local level as well. municipal governments have a good idea of how local farmers operate and the needs of citizens in the area. So I think coordinating that kind of thing is a real way forward.
It's pretty small scale, but at least in DC, I ran a homeless shelter, a Catholic worker shelter for 6 years, and the largest soup kitchen in Washington, DC. And now there's in Northeast DC, there's a Whole Food, not a Whole Foods as in the grocery store Whole Foods, but it's a Whole Foods produce market. It's multiple city blocks, and they give away stuff that cannot still be taken to the grocery store and sold. So it's lots of fruits and vegetables and other things, or rice where the bag is damaged or whatever else. And so every week we would go, and the Catholic Worker still does that. They also do this in Los Angeles. Go and fill up a van and take it to various shelters around the city. And I would guess, it's obviously pretty small scale, but I would guess just about anybody who wanted to do that, there are probably things like that in every city where you could get permission. It's sort of an organized and bigger scale version of dumpster diving.
Yeah, that's a lot of what it is. When I hear us all talking about these community efforts and volunteer efforts and different organizations that are trying to take care of this and redistribute food waste, I'm reminded of Jan Poppendiek's Sweet Charity, where she talks about this really should be the role of government to be doing this. This is something that should not be a volunteer effort, and that to all of us would probably be part of what we would call food justice. And I don't know exactly where all of us come down on that and how what we talk about and write about and what we teach plays into that. But I did get a question from somebody on, can we talk about food justice a little bit? And for me, it's how we deal with the food that's produced and keeping it from going to waste. That there is some role that the government needs to play in this, local, state, federal, on distributing that. You guys have any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think I would agree with Janet Poppendiek in her book that basically poverty and hunger, we have really high rates of poverty and hunger for the developed world in the United States. And that really is a policy choice. There is no reason for that. And we have the resources that every kid in the country could have and should have sufficient access to food. And it is a total policy choice that that's not the case. And one of the things that I have been really hopeful about during the pandemic, and I remain hopeful about, is the way that policymakers in the local level during the spike in hunger that happened because of the pandemic realized that they had this incredible piece of infrastructure all throughout every city in the country, and that is the school cafeteria. And the school cafeteria is something that has been defunded, and we've the budgets that people that these cafeteria operators have to feed kids are tiny. There's this horrible situation of some kids who are poor get a free lunch and other kids pay, and that creates stigma. And then because we're America, of course, we have school lunch shaming where kids get behind in their school lunch bill and are, we saw lots of stories about this late in the Trump administration, although it was happening before that as well. And I think that, right now, the USDA just announced universal free lunch at every school cafeteria in the country because this crisis is ongoing. And I have a lot of hope that that program could stick around after the pandemic. And that is just one way. If every kid had access to a universally free school lunch and we invested in it, it's just one thing. It's just one piece. It's one example, but it would be a way to start to solve the hunger problem. And then besides that, it's pretty simple: raising wages, possibly something like a universal basic income. But there's no reason to have hunger in the United States.
No, you're right, and I think that it's a really good point. Tom, about the school cafeteria as a resource. It's a structure, right? It's something that exists and can be used in a different way. We have to wind it up really soon, but I've got one more question that I think is really interesting, and it sort of gets at something I've been thinking about too. This is for Bruce. It's somebody's wondering if you and GFI are getting any pushback from farmers. I'm sure this person means negative pushback. Does your institute address a different kind of future for the people who are raising animals right now?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little fascinating. The pushback we get is from folks in the regenerative community who, obviously, well, I don't know, maybe somebody on the call can take that side of the equation, but we feel like what we are doing is a nice complement to the rest of the work that's happening. So I think that, you look at something like Project Drawdown and food waste and cycling crops through animals are two of the top 6 solutions that they list to keep climate within 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, either of the goals of the Paris Agreement. Because alternative proteins require a fraction of the land, they allow for a move away from monocropping. Even for chicken, it requires 1/9 the pesticides and herbicides. It gets even better when you're talking about pork and beef. All of the freed up land can be used for a variety of purposes, and we can move toward regenerative ranching and away from feedlots. So we see it as a complement, but there is a sort of we eat our own ethos, I think, oftentimes in the progressive movement and also in the food movement, where if you are not doing what somebody is doing, what somebody else is doing, they think you should stop doing what you're doing and do only what they're doing. So we see alternative proteins as a nice complement to the rest of the food movement. And our big international goal is let's get the whole world thinking about food's contribution to adverse climate impact and figure out what the solutions are. But we do think alternative proteins is a big part of the solution because it scales, we think, a lot more nicely than most of the rest of it, and it helps to facilitate and make easier most of the rest of it.
Thank you. It does scale. I think we gotta leave it there. We're out of time, ladies and gentlemen. You covered a lot of interesting ground. This is the kind of stuff I live and breathe on. So thank you so much for coming, Tom, Elizabeth, Bruce. You provided some very nice insights. I would like to do this again. I think we're going to do this again next year at EcoFest for sure, and maybe get a few other people involved also. You've given us many things to think about. Mille grazie. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
What a wonderful
Thank you.
panel. What a wonderful discussion, everyone. Mark, Elizabeth, Bruce, Tom, thank you so very much. What a great way to end the panels for the day. Lots of good energy and lots of good information. Thank you.